this course has been taught for decades to thousands of MBAs who have repeatedly reported the course as A, life-changing, and B, the course that has served them best in their careers and in their lives, personally and professionally, which, by the way, is why we wrote the book, because we thought, well, if it has had that kind of an impact on thousands of students for decades, maybe people beyond Stanford Business School would like to learn these lessons.
Today, we are talking about relationships. And no, I'm not talking about dating. I'm talking about truly exceptional relationships where you feel fully understood and supported for who you are. It's said that networking can have a bigger impact than education, marketing, or anything else that you do for your business. So this is important. I just finished reading this new book, Connect, Building Exceptional Relationships with Family, Friends, and Colleagues. It's based on Stanford's very popular course, Interpersonal Dynamics, also known as the Touchy-Feely course. And authors David Bradford and Carole Robin, they say that the process for building and sustaining these relationships, they can be described, learned, and applied. That means that you and I can actually learn strategies to make better and more connections. Who doesn't want to do that? So I'm really excited about this episode of Inspired Money. We get to talk to Carole Robin, who spent 17 years at Stanford's Graduate School of Business teaching this course about relationships. She is a relationship expert. Today, she heads her nonprofit, Leaders in Tech, where she teaches leaders of high-growth tech companies the very important interpersonal and soft skills that characterize high-performance leadership. About this book, if you don't want to take my word for it, look at these quotes from Ray Dalio, Arianna Huffington, and LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman. Impressive, right? Before we move on, please take a moment to hit subscribe to our channel so that you won't miss the next interview of value like this one. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you take a relationship from shallow to exceptional by cultivating authenticity, vulnerability, and honesty? Let's find out. Let's get inspired with Carole Robin. Carole, welcome to Inspired Money. I'm so excited to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Let's jump right in. What's your earliest childhood memory of money?
You know, it's so funny that you should ask me that because I haven't thought about this. Right, that's probably why you start with this question. I hadn't thought about this in a long, long time. My very first memory is of getting something called a Tostone, which is a coin in Mexico. I was raised in Mexico. And I remember getting this Tostone, which is like a dollar, or the equivalent of a dollar now, I guess, a coin, from my mom, because I was going to walk to my good friend's house, which is literally across the street. And then the two of us were going to walk to get some candy. And the Tostone was for the candy we were going to buy. And it's all tied up with my first memory of independence. It was like I was going to walk by myself across the street to pick up my friend who was a couple of years younger. And I had a Tostone, and we were going to go to the store. We were going to pick what we were going to get candy-wise. And I still remember it vividly.
Interesting. So the power of a currency, but how it translates to independence for even a small child.
Yeah. And I think beyond independence, I had really literally never thought about this until this very moment, not even like in anticipation of this call. But, you know, my whole life is about relationships, and my work is about relationships and about building more meaningful, fulfilling relationships, and how to build, and trust obviously is a really important aspect of that. And I had never thought until this moment about the fact that my mother trusted me. She trusted me with a coin. She trusted me to walk across the street. She trusted me to do the right thing. And that's really, it adds a whole new dimension to that memory for me.
I love that. I want to know, can you tell us about your circuitous path to teaching one of the most oversubscribed courses in Stanford University's MBA program?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's a really long, circuitous story. And so I'll try to keep it brief. But I've had many careers, depending on how we count, probably 6. My very first career was in sales and marketing and industrial automation. In 1975, I went to work for a very large company, Fortune 50 company, as the first non-clerical woman hired into the organization. And then 10 years later, I got engaged and married and had a kid. And by then it was before I had the kid. I realized that I was traveling 100,000 miles a year. And I wanted to actually have an opportunity to be home with my kid. And in fact, my husband and I had made a deal that we would take turns and that we would we were at the same point in our careers when we got married and decided to have a child. And so I decided we both wanted the experience of being a full-time caregiver. We both wanted the experience of being a full-time wage earner, supporting the family. So we decided I would step out first, he would stay on, and then his career would continue to unfold. And then eventually we would switch places. And that's what we did. Now, given that your audience is probably business and money focused, one thing that might be interesting for them to know is that we froze our standard of living when we made this deal, because we knew that when I got back into the workplace, I wouldn't be able to earn. It was unlikely that I'd be earning what he would be earning when he left. And so in freezing our standard of living, all the money that he made in the more than 10 years, 13 years that he was continuing to work and I was home, we banked. And so when I got back into the workforce, we had a big cushion and it didn't impact our standard of living at all. And then eventually I earned as much as he earned when he left and everything was smooth sailing. So the deal we made was that I would stay home. Well, I had always thought, well, I'll go back to sales and marketing and some kind of tech or something technical. And but funny thing happens when you stop along the way and look around and get off the treadmill. And for me, it was discovery of the nonprofit world, because when my kids were really little, even though I had no need or desire to go back to work, I did have some hours in the day that weren't completely consumed by them, especially as they started going to school. And so I got involved in the nonprofit world, and that's what I call my nonprofit era. And I joined a few boards, and that's where I discovered organization development and leadership development. And then I decided, when it's my turn to support us, I think I don't want to go back to sales and marketing. I want to go into organization development and executive development. And so I went back to school. I had to get a master's in organization development, decided that wasn't going to be enough, got a PhD. And then that gave birth to my consulting era. So I went to work as a principal and a partner in a consulting firm after I got my PhD. But eventually that's what led me to Stanford, because one of the members of my committee knew my co-author, actually, of my book, David Bradford, and said, hey, they're teaching this cool course over at Stanford, and I think you should go meet David Bradford. You'd be great. And so I went and met David Bradford, and at the time that they were teaching 4 sections of this course called Interpersonal Dynamics, which the students affectionately call Touchy-Feely. And when I arrived, there were 4 sections of 36 students. When I left in 2017, there were 12 sections of 36 students. And it was still oversubscribed, and there were still students who couldn't get into it that wanted to. And And then I left Stanford and started up my Leaders in Tech, which is my latest venture, which is a nonprofit trying to bring much of what I taught at the GSB and the MBA program to leaders in the Valley that are founders of Series A or beyond startups, but pre-IPO.
Wow, your depth of experience and perspectives, I would imagine there's just so much value because many of those experiences are so different. Before we dive into interpersonal dynamics, I want to take a step back. When you had your first child and you're having this discussion with your husband, because you are now known as a relationship expert, many people don't talk about money very openly, even with one's spouse. Obviously, you didn't have that issue because you were very strategic in your planning and you froze your standard of living.
Yes.
What was that like, those discussions with your husband at that time?
Well, I'm gonna tie that answer back to what I was just saying, which is even though I've had this very varied career or many careers, the through line of them all is the importance of relationships. And what always kept me anchored was that was what was most important to me, was the depth and of relationship I was able to develop and the meaning and fulfillment that gave my life. And so now if I come back to your question about, so I think I was just wired for relationship, and relationship really requires openness and vulnerability. And it felt like the most natural thing in the world for me that Andy and I discuss what were we going to do about the finances if we were going to try to execute on this life plan. And that's what we called it, a life plan. Now, two business people get together and they get, married, and we both had, we were on the same trajectory. We were both junior executives in big companies, and we were both fairly strategic thinkers, but it made total sense to us that we apply the same standards that we applied to our business to our relationship and vice versa. So they don't seem that separate to me.
When you froze your standard of living, did that feel like you were making a sacrifice?
No. Great question, because we already thought we were living better than 99.9% of the people on the planet. So, really, we had a house in Palo Alto, California. We didn't need a bigger house. We didn't need more cars. We didn't need fancier jewelry. I had my diamond. I only needed one. It was very clear to us that, and I will say that at the time, we already felt we were living great. Over time, as we remained true to the plan, and we saw all of our friends getting bigger houses, taking fancier trips, getting fancier cars, it took discipline to say, oh yeah, maybe it would be nicer to have, and maybe it'd be nice to have a second house in Hawaii, but you know what? Then we can't live the plan. Maybe it would be nicer to, I don't know. There were. I can't even think of some of the things that we would have thought. And I still remember how one of the things that made it easier for us to stick with the plan was that we ended up having a son and a daughter, a boy and a girl. And as we made the swap when our youngest child, we were going to make the swap originally when our youngest child was well established in elementary school. But because I decided to go back and get a PhD and completely change careers, we ended up not making it until our youngest was in middle school. But one of the things that kept us on the path was that we realized that we were role modeling alternative ways to live a life. Our son wasn't going to have to feel like the burden of supporting the family had to be his because he was the boy. And our daughter was never going to have to think that her primary role had to be to stay home and raise kids. And as we saw those roles fall what's the right word I'm looking for? As we saw so many of our friends fall into those roles, it became clearer and clearer to us that that was not what we wanted our kids to see. The other thing that, of course, many of our friends had as an alternative was that they both remained in their careers and they both tried to do both. And that, I have no judgment about people who make that choice. And I certainly have girlfriends who stayed with their very successful careers, and it would have been worse for their kids for them to stay home because they would have been resentful of what they were giving up. But for us, we knew that we wanted one parent at home as a primary caregiver, but it didn't have to be the mom. And by the way, when we made the switch, and my husband was an executive vice president in one of the largest Silicon Valley semiconductor companies, nobody could believe that this had been our plan. And nobody could believe this was actually why he was quitting to stay home. They thought he'd had a nervous breakdown. They thought maybe he was dying of cancer. Other than our very closest friends, certainly the people in business thought, no way. Why would somebody leave at the pinnacle of their career when they're making that kind of money to stay home with their kids because they made a deal with their wife?
So people thought you were a little crazy, or they thought he was crazy.
Yeah, they still think we're a little crazy.
All right, so you say that you were kind of hardwired for relationships. I would imagine that working in industrial automation and being in sales, naturally, you see the value of relationships. When you eventually got your master's, your PhD, and you started doing research to kind of back the real world experience that you saw, that backed your real world observations, did you feel like, now I'm home, like I'm in the right place?
Yeah.
I can't believe I'm here.
Yeah. That's such an accurate depiction of what was going on for me. First of all, it was then that I realized that, and this was core to what I taught my students, core to what's in the book. People do business with people. They don't do business with ideas or product or strategy or even money. They do business with people. And the reason I was successful, very successful, really in all my careers, was that was a guiding principle. And so you're right that when I got to the point where I did a master's and then a PhD in human and organization systems, one of the things that was wonderful for me to discover was that there was science that backed up my experience. Now, I am not a career academic, and even though I got a PhD and taught at one of the most elite universities in the world, I am not an academic, and I am actually what is known as a scholar practitioner, which means I'm marginalized in both worlds. The scholarly world thinks I'm not research-based enough and I'm not scholarly enough. And the practitioner world thinks I'm too academic. So, which, perhaps is predictable or not inconsistent with other things you're learning about me, which is I beat to my own drummer. If that's what people think, oh, well.
Initially, do you find that is there any pushback to register for the Touchy-Feely course? And I'm curious because it just seems like we know that relationship is so important to leadership, but these soft skills are often things not taught in school. Yeah. So people aren't used to it, even though it's similar with money. A lot of us don't get direct money lessons in school. We don't get soft skill lessons in school.
Right, right.
So there's kind of an argument that shouldn't those be the things that we are learning in school?
Oh, there's a big argument to be made for that. So, look, this course has been taught for decades to thousands of MBAs who have repeatedly reported the course as A, life-changing, and B, the course that has served them best in their careers and in their lives, personally and professionally, which, by the way, is why we wrote the book, because we thought, well, if it has had that kind of an impact on thousands of students for decades, maybe people beyond Stanford Business School would like to learn these lessons. Now, your question about, is it hard to get students to enroll? We found the exact opposite, which is we just didn't have enough capacity. I don't know that it was that way at the beginning. When my co-author David Bradford started the course 45 years ago or 50 years ago, when there were 12 students, a lot has changed. First of all, Daniel Goleman's book on emotional intelligence came out 25 years ago. That woke a few people up. And his research showed pretty unequivocally what the impact was of people of leaders who were high in emotional intelligence and their ability to create high-performing organizations. So that helped. And then, alums talk, they come back for reunions, they talk at events, and every time there's an event like that, they say, if you do nothing else, make sure you take this class. And now, the course has been oversubscribed for probably, 20 years since I got there.
How did that make you feel?
That is one of our favorite questions, because by asking people to talk about how they feel, you ask them to both be a little vulnerable, but you also get to know them better. So I felt privileged. I felt proud. I felt incredibly hopeful for what it might mean to the world that future leaders would be armed with these competencies and the capacity to build meaningful relationships, and what that would mean not only to their families, but to their communities and their organizations. I still feel that way. I felt and feel so optimistic because of the possibility that's embedded in these competencies. And occasionally, I also feel, I don't know if the right word is anxious, but, I'm also very driven. And so probably not surprising after you've heard my, life story and all my careers. And so I get really anxious and I'm impatient, and my anxiety and impatience sometimes manifests into, oh my God, we're not getting this out enough, or we're not getting this to enough people, and we got to get this way out there, and it can't be just business people, it's got to be community leaders, and it's got to be people in government, it's got to be teachers, everybody needs to know this. And then my co-author, God bless him, and by the way, that's why we work in teams, to suggest that I take a breath and that we're playing a long game. And then I take a breath, and then I go back to playing a long game.
So I figured that professors kind of write like most people breathe. Why did it take so long? Why decades after teaching this course does the book connect building exceptional relationships with families, friends, and colleagues come out?
Another wonderful question, because we didn't believe we could do justice to the course in a book. The course is highly experiential, meaning you learn to be more interpersonally effective by interacting with other students and being told in real time what it is that you do that either creates distance or closeness, trust or mistrust, influence or loss of influence. And so reading about it, we kept thinking, I don't know, people are going to read it and just toss it aside, or it'll sell 1,000 books to our biggest fans, and that'll be it. And so it wasn't until our editor from Random House who came to us and said, look, why does this incredibly famous course exist and there's no book? And we said, because it can't be learned in a book. And he said, so you're okay that the only people who get to learn this are the people who are privileged enough to get into the Stanford Graduate School of Business and get into your class? And so then that's what made us decide maybe we should actually buckle down and write the book. And that's why it took us 4 years to write it. We didn't just, oh yeah, well, we'll just write down all the principles and great, right? Well, then we would have sold 1,000 books. And so we had to really think carefully about how to bring the lessons to a reader and how to, in fact, in the book, every chapter ends with not only a particular concept having been described through a story, because we follow the storyline of 5 different pairs, a father and a daughter, a couple of colleagues, a man and a woman, a married couple, 2 really good friends. And so we learn about these concepts like the importance of vulnerability and being willing to allow yourself to be more known as an example of a concept. But then you read the story of Mia and Anya allowing themselves to be better known by each other. And then at the end, the chapter ends with suggestions on what you can go do to experiment with allowing yourself to be more known, and then reflecting on what it is you learned in the doing, which is what the students get to do in real time. And that's why it took so long.
It does read like a handbook that provides the reader with strategies to apply to their personal and professional lives. How does, what is my question? My question is...
Well, what are you feeling?
I feel like when we're young...
but hang on.
Okay.
I feel like is not going to be followed by a feeling. You read that, right?
Yes, I did read that.
I feel, insert feeling.
I feel when you're younger, relationships are more easily formed. That as we get older, sometimes it's challenging, or maybe we're less open to forming meaningful relationships. And it seems like the end goal in the book is that we want to develop exceptional relationships. Can you define what an exceptional relationship is?
So 2 things. One is what you just said was still not a feeling. Those were all thoughts.
I know.
So you might be feeling suspicious or unclear or curious or skeptical, or those would have been feelings, by the way. And which is why, by the way, there's a vocabulary of feelings in the book, because everybody struggles with what you're struggling with right now. So I hear what you're saying, and and I'm getting to know you a little bit in your question. And I know your question would have that much more meaning and nuance for me if I knew what the feeling was that was attached to it.
I think I feel more insecure about trying to develop exceptional relationships the older I get, because we always make excuses. We say, oh, I don't have time to make these closer friends.
Yes.
Things like that.
That's great. I'm so glad we went a little farther in that, because that insecurity is the result of having taken risks that didn't pay off, probably, or certainly of becoming even more aware of how much risk there is in putting yourself out there, in trying to connect with somebody else and being rejected. It also, by the way, is connected to experience you might have had where you spent a bunch of time trying to connect to somebody and nothing happened. And then you think, well, that was a waste of time. So you're right that as you get more life experience, the risk factor goes up, which is why one of the things we have to learn to do if we want to create more fulfilling, meaningful relationships is take some risks. Now, the first 10 chapters of the book, I I think it's the first 10, maybe it's the first 11, are about how to create functional, robust relationships. And everybody can take any relationship to that level. We use the analogy of climbing a mountain and getting to the upper meadow. And everybody is better served by having those competencies and those skills. Now, once you're at the upper meadow, you can make decisions about whether there's a few people you'd like to climb all the way to the top of the mountain with. And that's what makes those relationships exceptional. And we are not suggesting you should try to make every relationship in your life exceptional, because A, it's exhausting, and B, it's probably not possible. The elements of an exceptional relationship are you are both willing to be honest and open with each other. You trust that whatever you say to each other won't be used against you. You're both willing to be more fully known to each other. You deal with conflict productively. You don't run away from it. In fact, you lean into it. And you're both invested in each other's learning and growth. And when you have all 6 of those things, you have an exceptional relationship. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have some of those at the meadow and have a much stronger relationship than you might have had if you hadn't done that. But it's when you have all of those that you've reached an exceptional relationship. And by the way, that also exists on a continuum. It's not like, okay, now you've made it. In fact, the last chapter of the book talks about how my co-author David and I had an exceptional relationship, had a huge fight. I said I'd never talk to him again. And the chapter is about how we came back using everything we teach and have an even more exceptional relationship after the fight. And by the way, after writing a book for 4 years together, an even more exceptional relationship. So the metaphor of climbing the mountain falls apart a little bit because it turns out that there are more peaks after you get there. Maybe it's that you slide back and you get back up there and you slide back and or you discover there's an even higher peak.
So is the takeaway that even 2 relationship experts still go through challenges and need to work through them?
That's certainly one takeaway. One takeaway is nobody is ever going to get it right. The biggest mistake we can make is to not learn from our mistakes. And so when it comes to relationships and what too many people do because they don't feel armed with enough competencies to do anything else is they retreat rather than lean forward into trying to make the relationship even stronger and repair it when it goes awry. Or let it just kind of, stay at some place, which, is not terribly fulfilling or meaningful.
So give us some tips on how can we attempt to develop better relationships and exceptional relationships. How do we get started? Because it sounds like with vulnerability, it can be a little bit scary to start.
Yes. So tip number 1, buy the book. Tip number 2 is, and all of these tips are now embedded in the book. So first of all, understand that one size doesn't fit all. What I do to create more connection with you might work great and might not work with, Jane, who's sitting right next to you. So we tend to think, oh, well, I did this with Andy. Well, that's all I need to do. I just need to ask people how they feel, and then we'll have a really interesting conversation. It'll take us somewhere cool, and we'll feel a little more connected. Well, that might not work with Jane. So tip number 1, one size doesn't fit all. Tip number 2, to your point about vulnerability, 15% rule. It's one of the guiding principles in the book. You're a skier. We were just talking about you went skiing. So when you first learned to ski, they didn't put you at the top of a double black diamond slope. They started you on the bunny slope. And after a while, if you knew what you were doing, and if they had, and you were in your comfort zone. And if they'd left you there, you'd have never become a better skier. And after a while, you probably would have gotten kind of bored. So then you move to a green circle run. And that's 15% outside your comfort zone. They don't take you from the bunny slope to the double black diamond. They take you to the green circle. So now you ski on that until you're comfortable, and then you ski beyond that. So the metaphor there is the green circle is your comfort zone. The comfort zone is in the middle. The danger zone, think of 3 concentric circles. The danger zone is on the outside, and that's the double black diamond slope. And by the way, if that's where you start, you never go back and ski again. But there's this middle circle called the zone of learning, which is where you have to expand to in order to get better and learn. If you stay in your comfort zone, you're never going to learn. If you go too far outside, you're not going to learn. You're going to be deer in headlights and freak out. So now that zone of learning, when I first started teaching students about it, they were like, yeah, but the minute I'm outside my comfort zone, I'm scared. How do I know I'm not in the danger zone? And I used to say, well, why don't you think of just being a little bit outside your comfort zone, 15%. And so that's where the 15% rule comes from. You know if you're feeling just a little bit uncomfortable, and that's good, because you're feeling just a little uncomfortable, you're probably learning and growing just the right amount. And then your comfort zone redraws itself, and then you can go 15% beyond that.
Since I was reading your book this weekend, I used the 15% rule talking to my wife, because she was saying, which trail should we go on with our kids? And I said, well, you have to just push them 15%.
Yeah, that's great.
and so that worked. In the book, you talk about pinches, which is something that bothers you, crutches that can grow into a bigger problem. And there are processes to remove blocks to deeper relationships.
Yeah.
And it's constantly this push and pull, I think, if it's a one-on-one and you're trying to build a relationship with somebody. But when you hit those blocks, when do you know when it's worth pushing forward and trying to work through versus, cutting your losses?
Cutting your losses?
And turning around and saying, I can build a relationship with somebody who's a better fit. This is not the right person.
So interestingly, it's not that dissimilar to investments. When do you know when to not double down and put more money behind an investment? There's a little bit of science to that, but there's a whole lot of art to that. And you don't really know. I would argue that when it comes to relationships, we actually have a little bit more agency than when it comes to investments, because there's so many variables we don't control when it comes to financial investments. Now, we don't control another person, obviously, but we stand to influence another person much more than we might be able to influence the factors that would turn an investment of money into a success. So how do you know? You're not really going to know. So the first thing you do is you accept that, you're taking a risk. And it depends how much it matters to you. How much do you care about this person? How much do you care about a relationship with this person? How much do you think you are both better off in relationship than outside of relationship? When I wrote David off and said I'd never talk to him again, even though we'd had an exceptional relationship, I was so hurt and I was so devastated that I, for a while, said, I don't care about a relationship with him anymore. Until somebody said to me, really? Really? You want to throw away a 17-year relationship because he did something that really pissed you off? And that's when I had to. And there's an example in the book of two college, two women that go all the way back to college who have a big disagreement, and one of them has to say, "Hey, I'm not ready to throw this away," but it doesn't mean the other person's going to reciprocate right away. So you know, you got to decide whether or not it's worth it, but based on your own sense of the other person and the value they bring to your life and you bring to theirs.
In the book, you talk about 3 different realities.
Yeah.
Since you brought up nearly cutting off the 17-year relationship, what was your reality, David's reality, and I don't know, what's in the middle? That's the tennis court?
Right. Well, so the 3 realities are, in any interaction between 2 people, as you point out, there are 3 realities. There's my intent and the way I see the world and my needs and my feelings. There is what I do, my behavior. That was reality number 1. There's my behavior and what I do, and that includes what I don't do. And that reality number 2 is known to both of us. We can both see it if we were watching a movie. And then there's reality number 3, which is how whatever I've done or not done has landed on you. Reality number 3 is Andy's feelings and reactions and the way he sees the world. So one of the ways we get in trouble is when we think we understand the other person's reality. So we talk about this tennis court as existing between my reality number 1 and my behavior. And if you tell me, you know, Carole, your problem is that you're not let's say I'm trying to turn it back into the David and me example for you. But David says to me, Carole, you're being unreasonable by asking me to do that. First of all, I see myself as reasonable. Second, so he's over the net. Carole, you're being unreasonable is it's not talking to me about my behavior. It's labeling me. It's even worse if he imputes a motive. You just want me to go advocate for you, and that's wrong. That's not going to build more relationship. He's imputing motives. He's labeling me. He is playing he's playing on my side of the net. You got to stay on your side of the court. So if he says, Carole, when you ask me to do that, I feel stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's all him. When you ask me to go advocate for you, I feel stuck between a rock and a hard space. And it worries me about what that's going to mean for us. I hear that very differently. And one of the things that we stopped doing, one of the reasons I wrote him off is that I didn't feel heard. And by the way, he didn't either. And so we were missing the capacity to understand what was going on for the other person because he was so hurt and I was so angry that we had abandoned rule number 1, another tip, get curious. What is going on for the other person instead of thinking because now you're over the net. Get curious and ask them, what is going on for you? Why are we so stuck?
It sounds like the title of the book could have been, instead of connect, communication. Because it's one-on-one. How do we better communicate and understand one another?
So I want to go back to pinches and crunches for a minute because communication is a slice of what we're talking about. First of all, you can communicate more effectively and less effectively to get a point across. But if what you really want to do is create connection, then you have to understand a lot more than just how to be clear and concise and accurate. If we go back to the question you asked me about pinches and crunches, pinches are when somebody does something that's mildly annoying. Our tendency is not to say anything. That's not a big deal. But then the person keeps doing it. And then we get more and more annoyed. And then pretty soon it's a crunch. Whereas if I had said something to you way back when it was a pinch, then we could have, resolved it right away, and we would have, and we wouldn't have had a big problem. Now, sometimes a crunch is unavoidable. The situation with David and me was not a series of pinches that built up, but a lot of times crunches are built up pinches. And if we go back to the basic model, the feedback is such an important element of connecting, and it's not just an element of communication. Because if I care enough about you and us, and you're doing something that is either bothering me or I think is detrimental to our relationship, and I know how to say that to you in a way you can hear it, then we're going to have a deeper connection and a more functional and robust relationship.
Carole, you're in Silicon Valley, so you're
Yes.
in the land of big data
Yes.
and technology and quantitative analysis of the big data.
Yes.
How does that relate to this need for selling to humans and human relationships and human connection? Are we moving away from that, or is it getting stronger that we must have that?
Well, I'm obviously going to be biased here, but I think that between what you just talked about with regard to how much of business is done, how much business focuses on data versus relationships, and the fact that given COVID, we're not even together and haven't been for a while. More and more people are recognizing something is off. Like I actually need human beings. We're wired. Human beings, Brene Brown says, human beings are, and research shows that human beings are wired for connection. We are, human beings don't do well in isolation. They don't thrive. They don't grow. They're certainly not happy. So I think that there's also, I think it's becoming, Leaders in Tech, my nonprofit, part of the reason it exists is that these founders are committed to creating companies and cultures where people will matter, even if what they're doing is developing, probably transformative technology. It's not, they care about more than just the technology. They care about the organizations they build to build the technology.
And then going back to your 6 careers, maybe 6+ careers.
Yeah.
In for-profit, nonprofit, and in teaching.
Yes.
What does money mean to you?
Money is nothing more than a means to an end for me. If I had an unlimited amount of money, or maybe limited, but if I had millions of dollars, I would give one of my books to every teacher in the country, to every CEO in the country, to every member of Congress, to every member of the legislature in every state, to every executive director of every nonprofit. To me, money is just, it's just a means to an end.
And Carole, I'd like to ask all the Inspired Money guests, how do you define success?
So I don't know if I have time to tell you a short anecdote, but some listeners may have heard this, but there's a story about a burned out executive who gets away for the weekend and rents a beach house, goes for a walk early in the morning and sees a distant figure that looks like it's dancing. And so she walks towards this figure. And as she gets closer, she notices that it's really an old man. And what he's doing is he's leaning down and picking up starfish and throwing them overhead into the ocean. And he's doing it so rhythmically that from afar, it looked like he was dancing. And so she stops and she looks at him. She says, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" He says, "What does it look like I'm doing?" The tide came up, deposited all these starfish on the beach. The tide went out. The sun's coming up. They're all going to fry. I'm throwing them back in the water. And she says, "What are you, nuts? There are thousands of starfish on this beach, maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. What difference could you possibly make?" And he leans down and he picks up a starfish and he throws it in the water and he says, "Well, I made a difference to that one, didn't I?" And the first time I heard that, I knew I was a starfish thrower. I knew that I was put on the planet to be a starfish thrower. But when I got to Stanford and thousands of students joined the starfish thrower and started throwing starfish, then I realized that what I was put on the planet to do was build an army of starfish throwers. And so success to me is about providing as many people as possible what they need to develop deep relationships so that they can lead more meaningful and fulfilling lives.
And where did that come from for you?
You know, I was raised in a very secular Jewish home. And when my 2-year-old son when I was getting ready to put him in nursery school, I thought, somebody told me about the Jewish day school, and I was like, well, we're not very religious, but okay. And somehow I sort of rediscovered my Jewish roots. And one of the most, if not the most important hallmarks of Judaism is Tikkun Olam, which literally means to repair the world. Leave the world a little better off than you found it. And I think Tikkun Olam was just in my genetic code.
I love that. Well, thank you, Carole. Thanks for sharing your professional journey with us, for sharing the strategies to build exceptional relationships. Tell the Inspired Money listener where they can learn more about you and leaders in tech and follow what you're doing.
So our website, www.connectandrelate, all one word, .com. Connect.com was exorbitantly expensive to buy. Connectandrelate.com will take you to everything you want to know about the book, people who've endorsed it, like Ray Dalio, who many of your listeners may have heard of, and Reid Hoffman, and Arianna Huffington, and also under authors, they can learn more about me, and there's a link to our Leaders in Tech website as well.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. Everyone should check out Connect, building exceptional relationships for family, friends, and colleagues. And I think I will be reading it for some time because I feel like it's not a book that you can just read once through, put down, and forget about it. It's a reference. It's like a reference book, a handbook, sort of
Andy,
giving you guidance.
My heart is soaring at hearing you say that, because that's exactly what we intended the book to be. We intended the book to be something that people will come back to over and over again, in the same way that our students kept journals. And they go back to their journals for years. And students have been clamoring for this book too, like, hey, I could use a refresher. So thank you. That is exactly how we intend for it to be used.
And I have not yet read the Appendix B, I think, which seems to like summarize. That's like the Cliff's Notes for me that I can always go back to.
Exactly.
And I look forward to reading that to make sure that I understand what's going on.
Excellent. Well, you're a good student. And by the way, a good student, somebody is, when I won the Distinguished Teaching Award, all I said was, you can't be a good teacher unless you have really great students. So thank you for being a good student.
Yes, older and older students, but we're always a student. Otherwise, if we stop learning, we're in trouble.
I agree. Excellent.